percentage of Americans in nursing homes over 65, anyone want to take a guess? 4%. Down from 5 in the last decade. It's declining. But what about being sick and being helpless? The vast majority of older Americans live independently, and about 1/3 of people 75 and older live alone. And over half of the oldest old, 85 and up, can go about their everyday activities without any personal assistance. You guys know these people. People get chronic illnesses, right? It's despite illness. It's not that we avoid it. But they learn to live with them. Like Ava Zeisel, who was an industrial designer, and she went almost completely blind from macular degeneration at 100. So she learned to design using balsa wood models. And I watched her. She had a big silverware commission from Bloomingdale's department store. And I said, was it more difficult to work like that? She shook her head and she said, no, the process, getting shapes out of the air, was always the same. So the vast majority of older Americans enjoy independent lives until they come down with whatever kills them. Another preconception, dementia lurks. My memory has never been any good, so maybe I won't notice if I join the 1 in 9 Americans over 65 who has Alzheimer's, and it is a terrifying prospect. But the numbers are growing because more people are living longer, not because the disease is becoming more common. Actually, the number of Americans getting Alzheimer's has dropped precipitously. The number is greater because there are more older people, but the odds of any individual getting it are dropping, right? And so I always say the real epidemic is anxiety over memory loss. And if you subtract that 4% of the people over 65 in nursing homes, 90% of the remainder will think just fine. And there's stuff we can do to help us stay cognitively fit. So what about another assumption? Old people don't have sex. Sexual activity does tend to decrease with age, but my 75-year-old friend Robin is having the best sex of her life, and she is not an anomaly. Retirement homes are hotbeds of romance. Almost 1 out of 6 new diagnoses of HIV is in people over 50, and sex is the primary mode of transmission. Thank you, Viagra. Another assumption, that old people were depressed because, they were old, and they were going to die soon. It turns out older people enjoy better mental health than the young or middle-aged. And who knew? Here's the kicker. Oops, sorry, I'm a slide behind. Oh, sorry. Bear with me. Not Alzheimer's, just incompetence. There we go. Most of us, that people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. It's called the U-shaped happiness curve. Google it. The first time I heard it, I couldn't believe it. I thought they cornered 2 80-year-olds and gave them a cookie and said, how are you doing? But it has been borne out by dozens of reputable studies in the U.S. and around the world, and it bears out independent of marital status, independent of socioeconomic status. So things started looking so much better that I graduated to I'm not Ray stage 2. Trumpet the fact that Ray and I are the same age because look how much younger I look. Weirdly, counterintuitively, exhilaratingly, the more I learned about old age, the less terror it held. And that turns out to be true across the board. University of Southern California did a study with AARP that established that, quote, less knowledge about aging is associated with greater anxiety about the aging process, unquote. The vast majority of respondents were aware that older Americans can learn, and they're either working or want to work, and they feel healthy. But most of them also thought of most older people as senile, there's that senescence piece again, pretty much alike, and having no capacity for sex, so no wonder they're worried. In this society, we see age only through the lens of loss. And from the outside, what people lose is more obvious than what they gain. The losses are real and wrenching. I am not a Pollyanna. But from the inside, the experience is different. People adjust. Life remains very much worth living. So the illusion that we can ever know what another person is experiencing is called the Psychologist fallacy. And a geriatrician at Johns Hopkins put this in a way that really stuck with me. His mantra was a Mexican saying, that the appearance of the bull changes when you enter the ring. The spectator's point of view is different than the matador's. The sight of an old woman hunched over a walker used to make me mutter, put me out of my misery. If I get like that, and now I mutter just as fervently, the bull looks different. The bull looks different. Friend's father was completely paralyzed along his left side by a stroke at 76, and he spent the next 17 years of his life in a wheelchair in a nursing home. And after one routine visit, he told her, I have to say, this has been about a perfect day. And her last present to him was a Berlitz textbook because he wanted to learn to speak Spanish with one of his doctors. I had to acknowledge and confront my own prejudices, my assumption, for example, that my friend's father would have been better off dead. As the saying goes, there are very few people who want to live to be 100, and most of them are in their late 90s. Here's another handy saying among geriatricians. If you've seen one 80-year-old, you've seen one 80-year-old, right? Compare a group of 14-year-olds to a group of 40-year-olds, or visualize any high school reunion. As the decades pass, of course, we grow more different from one another. So why are we so afraid of aging? Why do we assume that everyone in a retirement is the same age? That would be old. Or that older people are pretty much alike because of ageism. That's the official definition. I say we're ageist anytime we make an assumption about what people are like or what they're capable of on the basis of how old we think they are. It is ageist to assume that all olders are frail or wise, or to say that kids are like that, right? Ageism also affects young people. I mean, it affects everyone, but disproportionately people at either age of the age spectrum. It is ageist when some clown calls me young lady and expects me to feel complimented. It is ageist and ableist when olders refuse to use wheelchairs or walkers because the stigma is so great, even when the alternative is never leaving home. Ageism is to age what racism is to race. Both are socially constructed ideas that change over time and that serve a social and economic purpose. They are not about how we look. They are about how people in power assign meaning to how we look. Ageism is pervasive and corrosive, and yet a lot of people can't even define it and have no sense of how it plays out across our whole lives and how it distorts and demeans our sense of self, right, and our place in the world. Quote, it's as if nobody has a good old age anymore, let alone a good death, writes age scholar Margaret Gillette. Something in American culture blocks out the joyful and political images, causing people to leap over them to final images of helplessness, decrepitude, pain, abuse, and demeaning death, unquote. Aging is medicalized like a disease and commercialized as an opportunity to sell anti-aging products to the silver market. And what an opportunity, right? Because if the right pills and potions can cure it, everyone's going to come down with it. So what a market. So slowly, skeptically, gears grinding, my point of view began to shift. I realized that old age was going to be different and probably a lot better than the grim slide into depression, dementia, and puffy white shoes of my nightmares, although I am still worried about the shoes. Seriously, that was before I had to go see a podiatrist. I changed the name of my blog to Staying Vertical. My exhortation to fend off inertia, namely when an evening excursion is involved and I'm comfortably horizontal, stay vertical. But staying vertical is only a metaphor, and a lousy one, because it turns out you don't need to be vertical to age well. That was another misconception overturned. Take my in-laws again. Bill Stein shattered his ankle when the B-17 he was piloting over Belgium was shot down. And he's had 3 knee replacements, and Ruth had polio, and now she has post-polio syndrome, so she can't walk more than 2 feet unassisted. But she is the most vertical person I know. Her mode is denial. Powered by luck and willpower, it has propelled the 2 of them into their 10th decade like the Energizer Bunnies. And that brings me to I'm Not Ray, stage 3. I'm not Ray, and I'm not Ruth. Ray is going to be happy as a clam in Florida. It is the old age he wants. Denial works for Ruth, so far at least, and it is a powerful coping mechanism. I'm working towards the old age I want, and it it's not going to look like theirs. If I can't stay vertical, well, this chair rocks, the name I finally settled on for the whole project. I'm not saying that getting older is easy. We are all worried about some aspect of it, maybe running out of money, ending up alone, which, as Bill Thomas pointed out, is the biggest threat to a good old age, or getting sick, of course. And those fears are legitimate and real. But what never dawns on most of us is that the culture in which we grow old, or reach middle age, or even just age past youth, can make that process better or worse. And here's an example based on yet another misconception I started out with, which was that it seemed obvious to me that fear of aging must be rooted in fear of dying. Because fear of dying is human, right? Every culture and society and individual struggles to come to terms with it. Many societies, though, if you think about it, the fear of dying is human, but fear of aging is culturally constructed. Because think about other cultures where they venerate their older members. And if the proverbial boat is sinking, they rescue the mother, not the child, because their reasoning is that a long life having lived has value in addition to a long future, and that perhaps you could have another child. And the point is not that one ethic is better than another. I know that sounds weird to me, but that they are culturally shaped, and that means we can change them. And the relentlessly youth-centric drumbeat in this culture drowns out all but the positive about life after 65 or 50, when men dump their wives for fertile trophy versions, or 30, when women start to freak out about being over the hill. My daughter-in-law has a friend. She was a model. She's gorgeous. She's 32. She doesn't have a partner, and she is panicked about the next 2/3 of her life, which is crazy. Unless we challenge the underlying message that to age is to lose value as a human being, it becomes part of our identity. And that is internalized ageism, right? The more clearly we see these social forces at work, on the other hand, the easier it is to envision alternative, more positive, and more accurate narratives. So, how about dementia, the elephant in the room? Physical mobility is relative, but if you lose your marbles, you are screwed. Alzheimer's is an evil disease. The odds increase with age. We don't understand how it works. But we do know that some people whose brains are full of Alzheimer's-type plaque stay sharp as the proverbial tack. And we think it's because they build what neuroscientists call cognitive reserve, which is extra neurons and the connections between them. So we build it by exercising, maintaining social networks, and challenging our brains. And we also know there's so much interesting research. And I should say all this research, my blog, thischairrocks.com/blog, all this research is up there and it's searchable. So, or you can send me an email if you want to know any of the data on which this is based. So attitudes towards aging have an actual measurable effect on how our brains and our bodies function at the cellular level. People with more positive attitudes towards aging walk faster. They do better on memory tests. They're much more likely to recover fully from severe disability. They live longer, an average of 7.5 years longer, and they live better. There are no guarantees. My godmother, Anne, that's her in the corner with me, had an insatiably curious mind, and now she's 96, and memory loss has her on a very short loop, and it's growing shorter all the time, and it's wretched for the people who care for her. But she knows me, and the characteristics I love best, imagination, humor, courage, are still there, along with the imperiousness and self-indulgence that have always made her a pain in the ass. I am still available to her, and she to me. Here's the thing. Most forgetfulness is not dementia, or even a sign of cognitive impairment. And here's where ageism comes in, internalized ageism. Any prophecy about debility, whether or not it comes true, it dampens our sense of what we're going to do, and it dampens our sense of ourselves, especially when it comes to brain power. I used to make senior moment quips. I thought they were kind of self-deprecatingly cute, until it dawned on me that when I lost the car keys in high school, I didn't call it a junior moment. Right? I mean, we think, I see a young person forget something. I mean, this is meeting age, so I'm like, oh yeah, look, young people forget stuff too. These are just the ways we're brainwashed to think. So what about mobility? Well, it's all relative. Bill and Ruth can barely walk, but they have arranged their kitchen and their lives and their living room so they don't have to. I hurt all the time. What my grandmother called stiffness, my orthopedist calls stenosis, my acupuncturist calls chi stagnation, and my GP says it's arthritis. And I talk about it to my physical therapist, and I don't talk about it much to anyone else because it's boring, and I don't want to give it more bandwidth. I have to remind myself that pain is just pain, and that not all of it is age-related, and that the objective is to keep doing the things I want to do. So far, so good, although the goalposts are shifting. I used to whiz along on my bicycle, and now I am in the slow lane, and I still barrel along the sidewalk. I'm a New Yorker, after all. But I recently had to slow down for a friend in her 70s who was visiting, whose knees were killing her. Arthritis. She marveled that it had happened to her, and I will marvel when it happens to me. 10 years ago, when I moved to a Brooklyn neighborhood with a median age of about 23, seriously, I said that it would be time to move when I could no longer hustle up the subway steps as fast as the kids. That was during I'm Not Raised Stage 2, look how great I'm doing. Now, I let the hipsters pass or help me with my bags. I do. I mean, that was a big turning point for me. It's like, I can still heave my suitcase down the stairs, but it's like, what am I waiting for, right? Ask for help, you know, and whoever, I admit I'm sexist, I ask guys, the guys like their chest puffs up like Galahad, you know, they are really happy to help me. So it's good for both of us, right? So how about sex? When I was in my 20s, I knew that I was having the best sex ever and that older people weren't having any at all. Silly me. Those are not the memories that I cling to. That said, stuff does fall apart. It was a bad day when I was diagnosed with periodontal disease and vaginal thinning in one morning. Floss and that yellow Listerine that tastes like kerosene are doing the trick above the waist, and my gynecologist prescribed an estrine, which releases a low dose of estrogen, and it's doing the trick below the waist. Although my friend with the bad knees told me that you can't use it if you've had cancer. She's a breast cancer survivor. And she has had a fantastic sex life, but now lusts more for tenderness. And as she put it to me, she said, you can be intimate with someone in so many different ways, right? Some men are glad not to be led around by their libidos anymore. And it can feel great to turn that energy elsewhere, to let the whole thing go, if that's your choice. But it is easy for older women to feel the choice isn't up to us, especially straight women confronting a dearth of available men over 55, most of whose sights are firmly set on the premenopausal anyhow. A few years ago, an adorable young guy came up to me at a dance club and told me that I looked like Susan Sarandon. And then instantly, his face, like, he got all worried, and he said, I meant it as a compliment. He wasn't saying, I look like Susan Sarandon. He was saying, you look old and you look hot. A message so apparently contradictory in this culture that being compared to a bodacious movie star like Susan Sarandon risks coming across as an insult. American girls are sexualized at 8 and ushered over the hill 2 decades later. You don't hear, like, look less slutty or look less Asian, but look less old messages are everywhere, especially for women who become invisible sooner and more cruelly. That is bigotry. And we need to call it out as bigotry. When we accept the message that older equals ugly and freeze our faces with needle or cut them with scalpels, or dye our hair to cover the gray, or lie about our age, we reinforce that message. It is a really successful strategy, and I truly get it. I understand why so many of us do those things. But it is like a gay person passing for straight, or a person of color passing for white, right? It's not good for us. It's not good for our sense of selves, because we're hiding something natural and inevitable about ourselves. And also, from a political point of view, it gives a pass to the discrimination that makes those behaviors necessary. Aging means living, right? And living means aging. So think twice about what anti-aging products promise. Botox, Photoshop, spandex, they are not our friends. So compare what they wore and what we wear now to what people wore in colonial America, which was a gerontocracy. Older people held all the power, which is not so great either. What you want is a balance. And relatively, partly because not that many people got old, and older men held the reins. And think about what they wore. White wigs, and stiff frock coats, and stockings that bare the lower leg, fashions that flatter the older body. So again, the point is that these values, fashion is an indicator of cultural values. They are malleable. We can change them. We can choose where we find beauty, and we don't need to stop at 22. MAC Cosmetics launched a line, launched a line of lipsticks inspired by New York style icon Iris Apfel, is her with the big stacks. Is she familiar to any of you? They do features on her pretty regularly. And she uses these dark red and scarlet lipsticks, and they sold out instantly because I checked. And a friend of mine named Kelly, who just turned 50, wrote me a note about it, and she said she said it reminded her of a book she owns called How Not to Look Old. It was a big bestseller. And she said, it's full of tips like wear soft pink shimmery lipstick so it doesn't draw attention to your wrinkled mouth. And it's true. It really works. And Kelly said, that got me wondering, at what point will I stop caring about not looking my age and just wear what I like? Right? Maybe never. Maybe that would signal defeat, maybe victory. This stuff is complicated. It's different for each of us. The book is right about the lipstick, damn it. Sometimes I reach for a gentler color, and sometimes I reach for the red. Getting older has made me a lot more forgiving of my physical shortcomings, and that is really welcome. My butt and thighs were the source of endless torment when I was younger. But now that I'm in my 60s, I look down in the shower and think, not bad. I never thought I would be going strong so long after my sell-by date, and I am hoping for lots of company. I feel the same way about the rest of my social life, for which a lot of credit goes to my partner, who is an amazing culture scout. But unless we are at simulcasts of the Metropolitan Opera, we are almost always the oldest people in the room, and often by decades. And we don't like it, but we don't want to stay home just because we'll stick out. And I think of it as affirmative action, and that is really necessary in this age-segregated society. I just read something about how integration has proven to be the only strategy that works when improving education scores, when it's done right. And we need age integration in this society. We need to occupy a space. Bob and I went to a big electronic outdoor music festival a couple of years ago, and people were actually taking pictures of us, which was kind of creepy, but also well-meaning. And we made two good friends who were in their late 20s at the time, and they're real friends. And that's what someone came up to me the very first time I gave this talk. She said, we're real friends. And she was talking about a guy who was a friend of her daughter's, and they were fans of the same rock band. And she had never had a wild youth, and she had discovered rock and roll in her 50s. And she had become this avid concert goer, and she goes all the time, usually alone. She's having a blast, and she's brave, right? And in a less ageist society, what she's doing wouldn't call for courage. So, not to turn this one happy groupie into Rosa Parks, but that is how desegregation happens. People with the most at stake, that means olders in this case, step up and step out. They stop conforming. And I can tell I'm looking out at a room of people who aren't too worried about conformity, and that's a real pleasure. The open-minded welcome them. I mean, I'm sure some people, look at Bob and me and go, hey, what are those old people doing here? They're never going to be at the vanguard of social change. But we're having an effect on the people who are, and for the vast middle ground, we're changing, even if it's not consciously, their idea of what old people like to do, right? Just all the horror stories about living too long would have you believe. What live too long really means is cost too much. Despite the fact that according to the nonprofit Alliance for Aging Research, only 3% of the people over 65, Americans, who die every day cost a lot of money. 3%. And it would be lower if American medicine weren't geared towards keeping people alive at any cost and lousy at helping people die well, although we're making progress there. What is the greatest worry for most people? I bet you all could finish that sentence. Becoming a burden, right? To our doctors, to our family, to our community. it has become commonplace to hear even healthy, middle-aged people wonder about whether the ethical alternative will be to commit suicide. That is internalized ageism of the deadliest sort, right? You say that because you think as an older person, you have less value as a human being. It is the logical outcome of a political system that is increasingly hostile to paying for the health and well-being of its most vulnerable citizens. I've made out a living will and a healthcare proxy and talked them over with my family and my doctor. And that conversation is crucial because if we're too squeamish to talk about what we think we want at the end, we can't expect more of the medical establishment. And that has to be also an ongoing conversation because what we want, may change. I mean, I had to talk not that long ago with my kids, and my son said, well, what if you're hit by a truck, leaving here? And I said, well, I want that liver transplant. He said, well, Mom, that's an extreme intervention. I'm like, okay, we need to keep talking, right? So it is an ongoing conversation. Don't wait. I have friends my age like, we're still too young. No, you're not. My partner's healthcare proxy is his son because he thinks I'll pull the plug the minute he stops being entertaining. He's right to worry. Mine is my sister because I think it'll be easier for her to pull the plug, and I think that's what I'll want when the time comes, but who knows? Well, what's different? Older bodies benefit just as much from aggressive medical treatment, including serious interventions like CPR and chemotherapy and organ transplants, as younger ones. Older people have the right to want to stay alive and to the same choices as anyone else. The criteria for medical procedures, to quote bioethicist Felicia Ackerman, should be, quote, the desire to stay alive, medical need, and a reasonable chance that the procedure will work, unquote. That's it. I used to be flipped out by the dying part of getting older, but that's looking better too. It turns out that the old don't worry about dying. It was true of the people that I interviewed, and then I heard it from doctors, and then I read research about it. The older you are, the less afraid of dying. And it comforted me, but I didn't really believe it until I learned the science behind it, which is that the awareness that time is short does not fill people with dread. It makes us spend our time more wisely. Right? Like young people, this is an example from Laura Carstensen, who runs the Stanford Longevity Center. She says, younger people will go to cocktail parties because they might meet someone who will come in handy someday, even though nobody really likes cocktail parties. And older people are more likely to take a pass and spend the time with a smaller group of people who matter more to them. Children live in the moment because they don't have the ability to do anything else. And older people do it because they know that time is running out. And living in the moment is what makes us happy. It's why the very young and very old enjoy life the most, right? That's the neurological underpinnings of the happiness curve. And if more of us in the middle, or towards the end, could master it, we'd be better off. So that's one of the reasons I've become an old person in training, a phrase I appropriated from geriatrician Joanne Lynn. I know I'm not young, and I don't see myself as old, and I know an awful lot of people feel the same way. And we're in the grips of this cruel paradox, right? We aspire to grow old, and yet so many of us dread the prospect. So we spend a lot of energy sustaining the illusion that old people are somehow not us, right? It's that othering part, the making whatever, group you're prejudiced towards other than you. And becoming an old person in training bridges that us, them, the gap, right? And it means ditching preconceptions and looking at and listening to the elders around us with an open mind and re-envisioning our place among them. So it doesn't come naturally because as a species, we are engineered to live in the present. So here's an exercise I heard from a cheesy motivational speaker. Visualize your 90-year-old self, where you are, what you're wearing, what you feel like, and imagine your present-day self coming in the door. What would the older you say to the younger one? Would they thank you for the choices you've made, or scold you for being so short-sighted? Cornell gerontologist Carl Pillemer asked over 1,000 older Americans exactly that. What practical advice did they have for living well? And he expected them to regret dropping out of school or buying swampland. But over and over, people said, I wish I hadn't worried so much. Life is short. I mean, they all say people worry much too much about getting old, for one thing. Life is short, right? Take risks, travel more, say it now, worry less. I don't know what it's going to be like to be 90, but I'm a lot less apprehensive about it than I used to be. I see the 9-year-old me as withered and teetery, but also curious and content. And, of course, aspiration won't make it happen, but I don't think I can get there without the aspiration. Becoming an old person in training also takes planning because it is a tactical challenge. We have to work longer. We have to save more. We have to make friends of all ages and hang on to them and use our brains and get off our butts. And a dash of demography for anyone who thinks this might not apply to you. Thanks largely to clean water and antibiotics, the American lifespan has increased by 30 years in 1 century. That's a slightly misleading statistic because it's mainly a function of more people surviving to adulthood, right? So we've outsourced death from the young to the old, but we have gained an average of 10 healthy years, which is an incredible achievement. The odds are that most of us will live to be 80, perhaps even more, especially all the wealthy Asian American men in the audience who have the highest quality of life. The outlook for Black Americans is a lot less rosy. And lifespans of the least educated women, in particular white women, are actually contracting. Growing economic inequality, the premature deaths of the less fortunate, is slowing this fundamental measure of human progress. And it's pretty shameful in the wealthiest country in the world. But for those of us with access to health care and education, for the first time in human history, 4 living generations are becoming commonplace. We're going to have more time to figure out what we want to do with our lives. The imaginary line segregates us, and it pits us against each other, and it fills us with needless dread. So I'm going to get political. We need to reject the zero-sum reasoning that pits the old against the young. Don't buy it, ever. There is no evidence that youngers want to throw granny to the wolves. And as for the greedy geezer thing, more resources have always flowed in the other direction from older people to younger ones. You always hear this us or them logic around healthcare rationing. Why should we spend money on old people who are going to die soon? They don't say that part aloud. When we could spend it on kids. Why should it be acceptable to weigh the needs of the very old against the very young? We would never accept a similar argument based on race or sex. We would just reject it, right? It's not acceptable anymore. And that's what we need to do for arguments about rationing resources according to age. It would be unthinkable. We need to question the alarmist demography that depicts longevity as something we can't afford, that gray tsunami thing. I have a friend who came up with a fantastic alternative, silver reservoir, right? Language matters, right? Fiscal crisis, social collapse. The ratio of older workers to younger ones, that, this old age dependency ratio, it's been dropping steadily for 100 years. And nobody even noticed, right? And GDPs and life expectancies have been rising this whole time. So do we really think there's not enough to go around for Head Start and Medicare, right? For schools and senior centers? Resources are not inherently scarce. The U.S. spends almost as much on its military as all the other nations of the world combined. The scarcity is the result of policy decisions in a society whose oldest citizens are demeaned and disregarded. So when you hear that 2/3 of life is decline, or old versus young, or we can't afford longer lives, don't buy it. 2 characteristics of marginalized populations: self-loathing and passivity. What my daughter tactfully dubbed, quote, the yuck/pity factor that the prospect of growing old invokes in so many. Shame can damage self-esteem and quality of life as much as externally imposed stigma. And I'll go out on a limb with this group to say I think a lot of the village-to-village movement is based on an ideal of taking care of ourselves, which is really important to us, but it's also really important to realize that there's no binary. We all already need help. We already can't walk as fast or do as many things as we used to do, and we're continuing to be out in the world and do important things and enjoy our lives. So think about the shame involved in acknowledging that we need help. We all need help. There should be no shame in it, and that change starts in our heads, right? So becoming an old person in training is also a political act because it derails that shame and that self-loathing. It's not about being inadequate. It's about being human. An old person in training undoes the otherness that powers ageism and racism and nationalism and it makes room for empathy and action. And I love hearing how many of you have been involved in earlier social movements, like the civil rights and the women's movement, right? What those movements did is woke us up to entrenched systems of racism and sexism around us. And look how far the gay rights movement has come in just this new century, right? But ageism has barely leaped onto our radar, right? Who even blinks when older people are described as confused or pathetic or irrelevant or even repulsive? And again, when we say those things about ourselves without thinking about it. It is high time to mobilize against discrimination and stereotyping on the basis of age. When do we stop valuing people and why? Not because we grow old, but because we do so in an ageist society. What kind of world do we want our children and our grandchildren, and they may well live to be 100, to inherit? It is time for a radical aging movement. So, if you want to do something, the next time you're at a social event, go talk to the oldest or youngest person in the room. The next time you whisper, put a pillow over my head if I get like that, remember, the bull looks different. And the next time you wonder whether an attitude or a relationship or an outfit is age appropriate, reconsider the question. There's no such thing. And come on in and join me in this movement. I know you're all my compadres, and I look forward to seeing you on the barricades.